It is my distinct pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Dominic Lieven to the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia. Dr. Lieven is likely one of our most distinguished experts, having taught for many years at the UK's most prestigious universities. Dr. Lieven currently holds the post of Senior Research Fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge. In the past, he led the Paulson Program at the London School of Economics, where he oversaw the doctoral thesis of fellow Monterey Summer Symposium expert, Dr. Mark Galliotti. I'm butchering his last name. Galliotti, yes. Yeah. Additionally, he's a fellow of the British Academy. Dr. Lieven is widely published in his 2009 book, Russia Against Napoleon, won the Wolfson Prize for History in the Pre-Napoleon. Dr. Lieven's contributions to the study of imperial Russia and empire within history cannot be understated. Again, welcome to the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia, Dr. Lieven, and thank you for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to talking to you all. By the way, I apologize for the Groucho Marx hairdo. I've just been swimming.
There it is, I think.
Hello, Dr. Lieven.
Hello.
Thank you for an interesting video lecture and also book. It was nice to read an actual book, not just a series of papers, which I don't get the opportunity to do very often these days. I'm a graduate student at Georgia Tech studying international affairs and Russian language. And my question was actually sort of about your selection of case studies for the book.
Yeah.
I was wondering why you didn't include any examples from South or Mesoamerica, particularly the Incan Empire. Did it just not fit like your sort of definition of empire, or was it a lack of sources, or?
Meredith, sorry, completely to lower the tone by starting out, but I wish you could see yourself as I see you, because if you look behind you, you've got a sort of wreath.
Yeah.
And it looks as if it's your hat from where I'm looking. So you look as if you're the empress of somewhere, all yourself, because all you can see is the top over your head. It's wonderful. Sorry.
Well, I'm glad I'm thematic.
You're completely thematic. That's the way to put it. Look, yes, I mean, I very briefly mentioned why not in my introduction. I mean, one simple answer is cowardice. You know, I was already covering so much that I was in despair. I had to call a halt somewhere. The second reason was that I couldn't find anybody, and I have to admit, in all honesty, I didn't look very hard, but I did look. I couldn't find an emperor for whom the sources, particularly giving a sense of his or her inner life, was so wonderful that I said, I've got to have him or her, you know. So there was a bit of a push and a bit of a pull. It was also simply the case that, I mean, to a certain degree, all the people whom I studied, both the individuals and the dynasties, the empires, you could argue were part of a connected world. Your Incas and your Aztecs were off the map as far as my people were concerned. So if I was going to ignore anyone, I was going to ignore them, I think is the simple answer. I mean, this probably reflects my own wickedness, but I was more guilty about feeling that I'd rather underplayed the Persian tradition of empire, or the Iranian, however you want to put it, because, you know, that is a very important aspect of my theme, and it didn't get the same coverage as the Chinese, or to some extent even the Latin European, or the Islamic. But again, I was partly deterred by the fact that, you know, space was appalling, and partly by the fact that I couldn't find anyone who quite, you know, jumped out at me in terms of sources. That's, I mean, a truthful and slightly wicked response.
Julian?
Disappeared,
Meredith. Are you still alive?
I am, yeah.
You're there. Yeah, come back at me and ask me more.
Okay, give me a second. I'll pass it over to Julian.
Because this is a conversation, I think. You know, also, you know, yeah. It is also, look, I mean, one obvious point is that I'm dramatically ignorant about Mesoamerican history. The only thing to be said on the other side is that I was dramatically ignorant about an awful lot of the things that I, you know, wrote about. I'd never, I think, read a work on the early caliphate in my entire existence. I did initially think of it as Eurasia, and changed the title partly because I didn't want some snotty reviewer asking where, the Habsburgs in Latin America or the British Empire, the last chapter, where that quite fitted in. As always, when one's asked why one has done something, you can provide what you might describe as a truthful historical answer, or you can find a sort of more or less plausible ideological defense for what you've done. The two are not necessarily, as a historian will always know, the same thing. It'd be interesting to have the book reviewed by someone who is mostly Mesoamerican, sort of Aztec, or whatever, South American historian, and see whether he or she felt that there were things which weren't in the book, not just in terms of obviously they weren't there because, there's the specific, but whether knowing about the American empires would have added something fundamentally different. I think, I didn't look at sub-Saharan Africa. And my friend Jerome Dwindham, who's really the best person on dynasties in the world, at least I think so, obviously I read his books. And there certainly not having sub-Saharan Africa did mean that I missed some things out. But the elements that he had there from sub-Saharan Africa were to do with hereditary monarchy. They were not really to do with empire. Matrilineal succession, this kind of thing. I've never found empires as such, where matrilineal succession is the norm. So it was interesting. But I certainly felt that Jerome's discussion, particularly from an anthropological angle of hereditary monarchy, had something there which I plagiarized and pinched, but it was certainly original. I wouldn't have come to it myself, without reading him. Sorry, I'm rambling. I must shut up.
Julian, please.
Hi, I guess I never properly introduced myself. My name is Julian. I study Russian and politics at Middlebury College. I listened to the radio segment you did on Times Radio.
Oh yes.
When regarding the imperial, I guess, framework of this war in Ukraine. And one of the things that I was thinking about coming into this lecture about viewing the empire as a person, as viewing the emperor as a person, is kind of the idea of the cult of personality. And how the cult of personality persists or changes within empire. And one of the things you commented on in the interview was kind of Putin's use of emperor. Namely, you said that in one of his interviews, he was standing in front of Catherine the Great, yes. I think was the example you used. So I was just wondering if you could comment on how cult of personality of certain.
I lost you then briefly, Julian. I think you asked me to comment on the idea of Putin as emperor. Is that right?
More of the idea of the modern interpretation of emperors as great figures within history.
Oh, I see. All right. Yeah. Well, what's the best way to approach that? By the way, I should have said that. I basically leave writing about contemporary events to my brother Anatole, but I have written 2 or 3 pieces on this war, particularly from the perspective of end of empire and imperial history. So, if it's interesting for you all, I willingly send them along and you can have a look at them. They were not for scholarly journals. They were for The Economist and for various sort of odds and sods think tanks. Well, one thing to say, and I've been inspired to think more about this by a review which just came out in Prospect, is the extent to which an emperor is, something beyond a mere strongman. And it depends is the answer. I think, Machiavelli does tell one something. There is something inherent in leadership. There is something inherent in power. And yet at the same time, certainly if you're talking about the monarchs of well-established old dynasties, who've been brought up, to inherit a throne and have a very powerful consciousness of their dynasty and its place in history, you are dealing with something which can probably most simply be thought of as the term legitimacy, which is alien to a strongman, a presidential strongman in the contemporary world. The founders of dynasties are a different matter. There you have the best parallel. I mean, in terms of, the contemporary Russian government, Putin in particular, well, it seems to me undoubtedly he does see himself as the continuer and restorer of, the imperial tradition in the tradition of Catherine and Peter. I mean, there's a good deal of obviously, delusion and self-flattery there. Peter and Catherine were very substantial figures, What for me was fascinating in many ways, he's also, certainly in his ideological statements, the pure product of the white counter-revolution, which is why an awful lot of my cousins, because I come from the white emigration in certain ways, an awful lot of my cousins in Paris and elsewhere are thoroughly pro-Putin, including in this war, because he is spouting what is essentially, Russia one great and indivisible, the ideas of the white counter-revolution. As I wrote in one article, though, it's one thing doing that in 1919, it's another thing doing it 100 years later. If you go back to the 1850s, 60s, it's perfectly fair to talk about Russians and Ukrainians being one people. Most educated Ukrainians would certainly believe that, though they would certainly, well, in many cases, have also had a strong pride in their local, regional identity, folklore, you name it, but they wouldn't, with some exceptions, have ascribed a great political significance to it. By the time you're talking about 1914, this is a very hot debate and is one of the underlying elements in the First World War, and a much more important element than is ever understood in the English-speaking literature. Obviously, the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the sense of a Ukrainian national identity and its political implications is much more widespread than had been the case 50 years before, but there is still a hell of an argument and battle going on. The Denikins and Wrangels of this world were not saying anything outrageous. It was still something very widely believed, obviously most of all in Russia, but by many educated Ukrainians as well. By the end of the Soviet regime, that is less easily said, though it does strike me that although a sense of Ukrainian identity is much stronger, more widespread than it was in 1914, it doesn't necessarily rule out a strong sense of close relationship to Russians or a certain loyalty to the Soviet state, society, sort of, whatever you want to call it. 25 years after independence, you're into a different world. I mean, it's, I'm not saying anything that is unlikely or fresh or new or original, but it does seem to me that, whoever he was listening to or whoever his ideas had come from, Putin was distinctly out of date in arguing this way. And actually, firstly, that made him look ridiculous internationally in terms of his propaganda, but also, I strongly suspect, it did very seriously affect his military strategy. I'm not sure whether Julian, come back a bit. Did I answer really what you wanted me to answer, or was I going off at a tangent?
No. I think you hit the main points. What I was trying to get at was where, I guess, the emperor as a person influences contemporary policy. I think you hit it. I have a general idea of your idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no question that since 1991, the emperors have come roaring back, no question about that, with obviously and necessarily Peter and Catherine in the lead, though interesting. I mean, I think Putin himself probably identifies more than anything surreptitiously with Alexander III. I mean, he's a pure statist. If he could have jumped from Alexander III to Stalin, he would have been very happy indeed, because he loathed Lenin and all revolutions. And on top of that, even, over and above the fact that he dislikes revolutions in principle, it is, after all, in his view, and in some ways correctly, the case that Lenin invented the Soviet Union, invented, the Ukrainian Republic with, in principle, not just its own institutions, but its right to secede. So, of course, he can't say this out and out because his regime, one pillar of his regime, is nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And, he himself comes out of that world. But I think in his heart, he identifies with the old regime and with the white counter-revolution. Anyway, people can come back at
Mac?
Yeah, hi there. My name is Mac. I'm a recent graduate from the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg. That's actually where I'm based right now.
The High School of Economics in St. Petersburg, which department were you in? I've forgotten.
The political science department.
Political science, because I know the history department there well. Our Portsmouth program, they were our main allies. I got all my books to the library of the Higher School of Economics. My Cambridge library, I gave them as a donation. Got there just in time before the war. Otherwise, it would have sunk at sea. Anyway, sorry, I'm chattering. Fire ahead.
Yeah, I wonder what their library is like. The one for the political science department is kind of small, but I'm sure the history department is doing better on that. I have a question about empire more generally, specifically about how we imagine empires today, how we think about them, and how we remember empires. I don't know if this is something you talked about in your book. I don't remember if it was brought up. Maybe it was, but it was something that was definitely brought up in the short introduction to empire in that book that was assigned to us. About how we tend to think today of empires being something bad, right? Whereas in the past, that was not the case. Empire was something that was a source of pride. It's something that, the empire builder, as mentioned in the short introduction, the empire builder is someone who's heroic, they're adventurous, right? And this is very different from how we today remember empires, how we think about empires. But at the same time, we also still do have that kind of, we still do remember some empires in that way, going way further back in history. When we think about ancient empires, the Roman Empire, for example, we don't necessarily think of the Roman Empire as being something which is just, pure evil or something that's bad. We still think of the Roman emperors as these skilled statesmen, as these figures that we lionize. We certainly lionize Alexander the Great as an example. So I was wondering why you think it is that the way we remember, the way we imagine empires from way back in history is different from how we remember and think about those empires of more recently. And my own impression is just that it's closer to home for us. Take the British Empire, for example. That's something that is much more recent. It's closer to home for the British people, and it somehow implicates people living today. They feel uncomfortable by this because it wasn't, too long ago, historically speaking. So yeah, that would be my question. Like, how would you explain these differences and how we think about different types of empires?
Sure. I didn't talk about this much in the present book because it was on emperors, really. I did talk about it a bit more in my book on empire all those years ago. But it's a very important issue. It's a question of how I should start. I mean, one point is the very obvious, that the contemporary situation, the salience of empire in our world, is mostly to do with the legacies of the West European transoceanic empires. One's talking about first world contemporary issues. Black Lives Matter would be an obvious one. Why are blacks in America? Why are they, to some extent, even in Western Europe? Well, for all the reasons we know about the slave trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Race relations remains a very big issue. It is not just a salient issue, it's an issue which is used by powerful groups in society. It's it's near the center of the culture wars which define much of contemporary Western politics, etc. And there are various obvious reasons. Slightly more broadly as well, if you're looking at one of the other really hot topics of contemporary international politics, which is global north, global south, first world, third world, as we were brought up to think of it. Clearly, that is more the product of the modern West European oceanic empires and the power of Western Europe, which was associated not just with political empire, but with the Industrial Revolution, etc., 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 etc. So again, you've got an enormously important contemporary political issue, which is linked, to the history of the modern West European transoceanic empires. Obviously, if you're passionate about first world, third world, north, south, passionate about what this is going to mean for climate change and what climate change is going to mean for those kind of inequalities. You look at the modern West European empires. You don't go off and look at the Ottoman Empire or Ming Dynasty China. So there are various, very obvious, banal, common sense points. Slightly back, if we were talking about the Cold War, if we were 50 years ago, let's say, deep in the 50s, 60s, 70s, again, it would be the transoceanic modern West European empires which are at the heart of the discussion. Because, the ideological struggle, which was at the core of the Cold War, revolved around Lenin's ideas about imperialism. And Lenin perfectly explicitly said that by imperialism, he's talking about the last stage in capitalism. He's talking about the West European maritime empires. He's not talking about the traditional great land empires of Eurasia. He says this explicitly. So again, if we were back, it's not just right now that the fact that the transoceanic Western empires at the forefront, they were back in the Cold War as well. And I suppose a cynic would say, perfect. Of course they are. They dominate the imagination because basically the First World, and above all Anglo-America, has for 300 years dominated most of the globe. It's been the predominant power, both in terms of hard power and ideas which originate in Western Europe. So are you particularly surprised that they dominate the debate about empire as well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of those, perfectly banal reasons. One, I've got to give a series of lectures at Trinity, my college in Cambridge, in about 18 months, and one of which will say, empire will certainly be part of that and of the subsequent book. Well, I intend to start by saying, let us take China and the Chinese tradition of empire as the paradigm, and imagine that we are going to derive our ideas about what empire is, was, etc., fundamentally from Chinese history. Would you come up with different ideas about empire? Well, I think to some extent, yes. One of the obvious things about the Chinese tradition of empire, not just that it's got its own absolutely specific element, of course, Confucian and legalist thought in the Warring States period, the historical myth of the Yellow Emperor and ancient Chinese imperial harmony, etc., etc. The specific institutions, ways, legitimizing principles of the Chinese imperial polity as it has developed over 2,000 years, except all those things you can take for granted. But of course, what is very interesting is that if you look at China, you begin to wonder. I think I said somewhere in the book, I think the Ming Dynasty at its greatest extent was about 3.1 million square kilometers, the Qing about 14.7 million. Is one talking exactly about the same thing? Are the Ming and the Sung really Chinese proto-nation states which non-Han bits added on? Whereas the Qing, or obviously the Yuan, the Mongols, and to some extent even the Tang, are great multi-ethnic empires whose rulers, after all, are either wholly or partly not Han Chinese in origin, etc., etc. And you get then all sorts of slightly different questions begin coming up. One of the things about the West European empire, certainly by 1900, is that the gap between metropolis and periphery screams in your face. Partly there's an ocean between, partly they're different colors, black against white, whatever. There's an enormous distinction in wealth, etc., etc., etc. But also, and very importantly, by 1900, at least the male adult population of the metropolis are citizens, whereas out in the colonies, you're dealing with subjects. These kind of distinctions don't actually easily apply if you're taking the Chinese tradition of empire as your paradigm. But of course, you're not going to make yourself very popular by saying that, because although in principle this is all wonderful and you're, whatever the word is, decentering and ending sort of, assumptions about Western domination, what that always also does is kick in the teeth, people who, although they may be very hostile in principle to the West European empires, nevertheless, their specific cause, if they're pushing Black Lives Matter, for instance, requires that we keep the Western European empires and their successors at the center of our attention. If one says, well, actually, the future is going to be dominated by China, so let's look at China first and take this as a paradigm, my particular obsession, my particular grievance as a black or as a this or a that, becomes secondary. So it's actually quite interesting to sort of put oneself in a position where one genuinely might de-center the white Anglophone world and regard it as actually possibly of secondary long-term importance in comparison to the Chinese tradition of, look, these are just ideas, but they do certainly help to explain why empire is still a very hot political issue, and B, just what kind of interests are tied up with keeping the West European tradition empire at the center of our attention. Was that an answer? Yeah.
Natalie?
Hello, thank you very much for coming in.
Hi.
My name is Natalie. I'm currently doing an MPhil in Global and Area Studies at Oxford. I actually have
Which
two
areas?
I'm doing Eastern Europe and Middle East.
Eastern Europe, good. Yeah,
Israel and
far ahead.
Russia, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually had two questions I was
Yeah.
hoping to ask that both bounce off of your answers to other people's questions. I think first, I would like to ask about the answer that you just gave to Mac about kind of the Anglo-centric view on scholarship. And I know at the beginning when you were answering Meredith's question about scope and how that is, of course, I'm sure I've never written a book and don't know if I ever will, but if that scope is, of course, limiting in terms of context and what you can write about. But if we try to move away from the Westernizing and emphasis on Western empires, then how does that progress? Because I've only been taught at Western institutions and I've only been taught about Western civilizations with a sprinkle of political correctness here and there. But how, and I understand that scholarship is limited, but has it started? Is it available for people to build on, or have we not yet gotten there where people still have to do the kind of the nitty-gritty work for us to be able to build upon that?
Look, I mean, in terms of available, even in the English language, excellent first-class work. Yes, there's a vast amount of excellent first-class work on the various Chinese dynastic empires, and of course on the PRC, which you might or might not consider still to be a sort of neo-empire. What I think is much more rare is an attempt to theorize, or at least generalize, conceptualize about what empire might or might not be, taking, let us say, the Chinese tradition of empire as your fundamental paradigm. That I don't think you do get. I mean, you may get it in Chinese. I don't know, but I would rather doubt it, because I think it might be rather dangerous to do if you were sitting in the PRC at the moment. And it's quite interesting. The Chinese are producing this last book of mine, just like they produced a number of my books. They didn't ask me to change or take out very much at all, and none of it, which I thought was fundamental. But it is interesting, for example, that one of the things they asked me to take out were my statistics for the Ming and the Qing, for instance, or my statistics for the size of the various Han Chinese and non-Han Chinese empires in the Chinese tradition. And that, of course, does, I think, speak to a certain sensitivity, as you might say, as regards the relationship between nation and empire in the Chinese tradition. And it isn't as clear-cut as in the European imperial tradition. And it is potentially embarrassing. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's also very important. Again, you know, if one, sorry, I'm now slightly branching out. I mean, the flip side of empire is nation. And the West European paradigm of nation, ethno-linguistic, democratic, etc., actually doesn't suit most of continental Asia at all well either. If you think of the great states of Asia, with the exception of Japan, which is more of a European nation, you know, conceptually than any European country is, you know, completely surrounded by the ocean, homogeneous, you name it. No wonder the Japanese, of all the non-European countries, made the greatest, quickest success of Westernization in that sense, at least in terms of power. But the roots of identity, collective identity, communal identity, historical memory, etc., etc., they're clearly very different in Iran, let alone in India or Indonesia, to anything which is remotely connected to the European ethno-linguistic, democratic conception of nationhood. You know, so it is actually, you know, one has to be quite sensitive and aware when throwing these kind of words around, because the words do actually, of course, when we use them, but because it is still, you know, there is an element of hegemony still, and English is our fundamental language, and other people come into it from the outside. The words themselves do, to some extent, bias the perception and the debate, you know, and that even old fuddy-duddy like me realizes that. That was your first question. Well, come back on this if you want, Natalie, or shoot out your second question, and then, you know, we could discuss them both.
No, I appreciate that answer. And I think ultimately and again, I can't speak to this, I'm not in academia, but sometimes it also boils down to also, you know, funding. I mean, if the funding isn't there, for example, and I know Oxford struggles with this in area studies,
Yeah.
Latin America, there is no African studies department. I mean, there's just no funding available for it. So automatically eliminates, you know, even just the amount of sources or library materials even that people have access to. So I know that is of course a factor as well. My second question is about something that you wrote in your book about the distinction between patron and friend. Which I wanted to probe a little bit further. I agree when you write that a friend denotes some kind of equality between people, and patronage insinuates obviously a hierarchy, or at the very least some sort of a power dynamic to a varying degree, what that might look like. But I wanted to ask you if it seems as though these qualities in leaders are still pervasive today. My initial thought is that perhaps nowadays they're in between this, I guess, spectrum of leadership qualities in between friend and patron. There seems to be diplomat, I think, that could be maybe appropriately asserted, because I think that diplomat doesn't necessarily denote equality, but I don't know that there's that much of a hierarchy in place. I don't know if this distinction has changed over time. I think diplomacy is an important quality to have for world leaders, and I don't know how much of a sense of equality is necessary for diplomatic relations to ensue.
I've never thought of this. Certainly, you know, you sort of slightly taken me back using the word diplomat.
Or perhaps I misspoke, I mean, there's a better word.
This is going to sound facetious, but it isn't facetious as an answer. It is entirely true that approaching an emperor, whether you were actually literally a foreign ambassador or you were one of his own subjects, to use the word in its modern sense, you needed to do so diplomatically. You needed to be careful with sensitivities. I mean, it is actually very difficult being an emperor, because on the one, or a hereditary monarch, but an emperor is a sort of, you know, king writ large, because on the one hand, you know, the dignity of the office is part of its power. There are real dangers for an emperor to, at least in public, with anybody he doesn't know very well, and that often boils down just to his own close relations. You have to keep up the mask, you have to maintain the distance, because that is all part of the authority of the office. How you combine that with anything that you might remotely call friendship is a very interesting question, and one which I pondered time and time again as I was writing the book. And one fundamental issue is to what extent does solidarity entail equality? And I don't think it really does. There have been many communities with a very strong sense of solidarity, but without, not just without a strong sense of inherent equality, but actually with a very deeply rooted sense of inequality. Is your nanny your friend? You know, it can be one of the warmest relationships you're ever going to have. It often, oh, for God's sake, it was in the English upper middle class world until quite recently. Quite often, these were the only women with which these wretched boys sent off to boarding school at the age of 6 ever really, you know, could associate with. But it isn't, again, just a facetious question. To what extent does friendship entail equality, and is friendship the only kind of warm emotional relationship you can have? No, I don't think so. I mean, there are plenty of examples I've seen of emperors who had a very warm relationship, really, with their servants. In some ways, an easier one, because the inequality was so immense and was absolutely recognized on both sides. Emperors could be a bit more cagey about being full-scale friends with great aristocrats, because great aristocrats might well think of themselves actually as almost on the same level. You know, it's very dodgy. These are very difficult relationships, and they become extremely more so when you're mixing friendship and politics. You know, there are endless examples in contemporary politics of how politics destroys friendships. But of course, if you look at, you know, Harun al-Rashid and the Barmakids, or Suleiman the Great, the Magnificent, with what was the name of his first, Ibrahim, his first Grand Vizier, those are friendships, and they go very, very, very sour. I think in Harun al-Rashid's case, this is partly because this is actually rather an insecure and uncertain person who both yearns for friendship and at the same time is terribly aware of his dignity and of not wanting to be taken over. Because one of the things, if you're a monarch, traditionally, is you're terrified of being taken over by other people, because you know from the earliest consciousness, and it's told you from the earliest consciousness by your parents, that people who approach you are usually trying to use you for their own ends. You are the supreme source of patronage, and court politics is all about patronage politics. So you get tremendously difficult you know, relationships building up, but very important ones. I mean, I think I said Louis XIII and Richelieu, this is the basis, that very tortured relationship. Louis XIII, a very complicated and difficult individual. And yet on that relationship hangs France's rise to replace Spain and the Habsburgs as Europe's great power. You know, and you get again with the rise of Germany. You know, William I is a far, way less interesting, but far more stable character than Louis XIII. But the relationship with Bismarck is also a personal one, not quite to the same extent as Richelieu's with Louis XIII, because Richelieu, well, Louis XIII is of course a far younger man, and Richelieu is almost as well his confessor. Again, you see there, it's very, you see the same things coming up, but not quite the same in different cultural idioms. There really isn't an easy equivalent to a Roman Catholic confessor in most of the other religious political systems I've looked at. And that's a fascinating relationship as well. So I found it very, very fascinating, and trying to tease out just what friendship meant, both what it meant as an ideology and what it meant as reality. I mean, you know, the Romans and the Roman aristocracy, of course, loved the idea that the monarch was primus inter pares. And the more intelligent early monarchs very much played on that love. Augustus was extremely careful to preserve the appearances. Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius genuinely did actually sort of feel, this wasn't just, you know, a game, but it was part of the ideology that this was still an aristocratic republic with an emperor who was a sort of convener of the elite. You won't get that in most of the dynastic systems I look at, but then again, you see again, you do get fascinating moments. Probably the only one of his advisors whom to the end, Suleiman the Magnificent, he doesn't treat him as an equal, nor does his chief mullah, you know, think of the Sultan as exactly his equal. And yet at the same time, Suleiman is beyond any question a devoted Muslim. And he does have a tremendous respect, Ebusid, for the man he probably rightly considers the most authoritative and impressive Muslim theologian, to use a Christian term, of his era. And that does create a kind of equality. So there are all sorts of nuances here, which are both structural and personal. Sorry, you've set me off in a complete ramble, but that is one of the issues of writing a book which is partly biography, that in the end there is never a complete final answer, because these kind of issues are to do with relationships, and relationships between two human beings are unique, even before you get the sexual element coming in, where, you know, it really adds a completely new, well, not completely, but an extra twist to the kind of very complex sort of mutual dependencies. Oh, and I want to say something else. Oh yes, sources, area studies, Natalie. Yeah, now look, it's not just that there's no funding. I mean, I'd probably say something now if you get me shot, but you know, for 31 years, I was in the politics department at LSE, and I was the head of department actually at one point for 3 years. And I don't think it's just a question of the funding not being there as regards area studies. Rational choice did to some extent seem to me to be the encapsulation wrapped up in ideology of a fundamental Anglo and even more American sense that, you know, rationality reaches its pinnacle in modern Western and above all Anglophone polities and societies. The rest of the world scrambles to try and reach that same level of rationality, and that therefore you can understand all other political systems to a great extent through a series of conceptions and even, for God's sake, mathematical equations, which are actually rooted in a lot of Western cultural assumptions. And everything is wonderful as long as the academics are just talking to each other in a sort of weird Germanic version of Anglo-American, in a manner which is incomprehensible to anyone else outside the university politics department. Of course, it all becomes a bit more serious when people trained in this way, meaning poor wretched American soldiers, find themselves fighting wars in deeply alien cultures in strange parts of the world, and suddenly realize that all these strange things that they've been taught at university and politics departments are not just irrelevant, but they're just plain wrong. And that can get you into some very, very nasty swamps. Meanwhile, your professors are still, well, if they're IR, they're sitting in the local 6-star hotel you know, occasionally, you know, trotting out to see what's going on from a distance. And more often, they're sitting back in their university faculties, still you know, shouting their arcane academic language. Sorry, that's just my prejudices.
Evan? Hello, Van, Ivan. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
You have a question? Yes.
I do, yes. Sorry for a moment of silence. Yes, my name is Ivan. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And I had just a comment on a question. It's I am Mexican Polish.
Sure.
So I was indeed reading the book with kind of both countries in my mind.
Sure.
Poland gets some mention, and one can think of kind of Poland's own struggles to consolidate some sort of absolute monarchy and so on. But with Mexico and kind of Central America before the Spanish conquest and colonial system, indeed, I can understand why you would be kind of hesitant to try to find there a type of an empire that would be commensurable with those that the book focuses on, because indeed it had imperial features, the Aztec Empire and at its peak, or the Mayan Empire, but maybe they would be more like the Greek city-state system at different points of consolidation.
Sure. Look, I do, and this may be, I do think that most of the greatest empires in history are Eurasian, and very, very often have their origins in some version of military nomadism. Anyway, I interrupted. What was your question?
My question, I have many questions. I think this book really stimulated, and the lectures and all the readings really stimulated my thinking, because I am interested in this type of processes of state building and empire building. But for today's session, I thought about only one question. Sorry for all the background noise.
It's me.
I can understand that
next door.
Yeah, no, I have my windows open.
Okay.
So I was thinking about one case that has really intrigued me when thinking about empires, which is that of self-proclaimed Emperor Bokassa of Central African Republic.
Yeah.
And I can imagine kind of thinking about your book and the kind of criteria of empire, why he wouldn't feature in the book, but because I know it's not a kind of intersubjective approach, postmodern approach, but was that case present in your mind?
It was more, I mean, I mentioned him actually in my previous book on empires, but basically, you know, to make the point that if you're thinking about the imagination of empire, and why subsequent generations might have imperial or emperor-like dreams, I think Bokassa is very interesting. But if you're actually, of course, trying to define in structural terms empire, then his Central African empire obviously fell rather short, you know. But as I tried to say in this book, so for God's sake did all those would-be imperial monarchs in Bali. You know, I mean, if once you retire into the imagination, well, in my odder moments, you know, I won't tell you the jokes now, but, you know, I'm sure that 3 a.m, I was convinced I'd personally defeated Napoleon on occasion while I was writing that book, you know, but the imagination gets loose. I mean, I think really with Bokassa, it's the Napoleon myth. And the Napoleon myth, after all, takes over a good many people who are much more sophisticated than Bokassa, to some extent with Bokassa, like with Idi Amin, you know, corporal sergeant in the colonial army, you know, of course, Napoleon is up there as a sort of weird combination of sort of indigenous conceptions of power and grandeur, but very much also the ones that the colonial power has taught, you know, not least in the army, you know. So it's, that I think is entirely understandable in a, you know, within that specific context. It is, sorry, I'm now more or less reverting to something that I'm not sure it was Meredith or who Oh, I think I was merely saying that although in the contemporary First World, certainly in Britain and even more probably in the United States, you know, empire is by now a curse word. I mean, we all know, and after all, this is also to do with the UN Charter by now, really, that if you declare yourself to be an empire, you are defining yourself as illegitimate, etc., 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 etc. And that is basically true of sort of non-academic discourse as well in the contemporary First World, even in England. And yet, there is still a sort of lurking sense that empire means grandeur. Empire means mattering in the great scheme of things. You see, I think that's why, so if one was, sorry, I'm now hopping around in a circle in my normal mind. I was thinking about Vladimir Putin. And people say that he's obsessed with empire, he's trying to restore the Russian empire. That doesn't necessarily mean, in fact, it doesn't mean, in my view, that he's attempting to regain direct control over all the territories of the former Soviet Union, let alone of its satellites in Eastern Europe, quite apart from anything else. I mean, he's still sane, and no such sane Russian ruler wants direct responsibility for Central Asia with the concomitant of unrestricted Central Asian immigration into Russia. What it does mean in terms of empire is really mattering and feeling one matters, status, a sense that one is part of the great sweep of history, that one's country matters, and that therefore oneself, the leader of that country, is someone on the top table. And in that sense, it's, the top table worldwide. In that sense, it's not fundamentally different to how things were at the end of the 19th century. The whole point of being an empire, in sort of conceptual terms, was that one was part of the top table, the sort of management committee of great powers, which was seen as determining the future of the world. You were not just ethnographic material, as they used to talk about it in the late 19th century. In other words, a small people with sweet folklore, but of no importance for the history of mankind or its future development. To be an imperial people and to be the rulers of an imperial people was to be right up there among those who really mattered. I think that's what I said, but maybe I was censored.
I think it's Adam next.
Where's Adam? I see you, Adam. Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Lieven, and
Hello.
Thank you very much for being with us today. So I'm a PhD candidate in political science at George Washington University, working on issues of identity and nationalism in Russia, and some of the macro-historical imperial sources of that. So I found all of this very, very stimulating and interesting. I had two questions, one of which was really a takeaway I got from the book and the lectures, was just the centrality of succession to political crises, to the longevity of a dynasty in a lot of these empires, and of course the differences between Mughal, Ottoman traditions of all of the sons fighting for control, and so really I had one eye to the modern period when reading this, and thinking about how modern day strongmen will often create new laws and try to circumvent existing norms of succession in a quite democratic or quasi-democratic setting. And I was curious, it seems that in a lot of the cases you were writing about, these norms are relatively enduring, and they seem to be very, there's a lot of competition within these norms of succession, but not so much a drastic change of succession pattern or not. So I wondered really whether that's an accurate picture, or whether there were instances of emperors trying to dramatically change the rules of the game in the cases you were examining.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a point that there are examples of emperors trying to change the rules. There are some examples of emperors successfully changing the rules up to a point. But as you'll know very well, succession is about the hottest issue in politics. Trying to change the rules of modern elections causes some excitement nowadays, and the same was certainly true in terms of dynastic succession. One of the endearing truths for about 2,500 years was that although nomadic polities on the whole were in military terms more formidable than sedentary ones, not always, but usually, they were in political terms more vulnerable. That was because they never really managed the question of succession. It always degenerated into civil war. Now, the nomadic dynasties which put down roots and made their compromises with sedentary society, in one sense or another, had to adapt their conventions of succession. But it wasn't easy. I mean, no polity could survive with a complete free-for-all in which every close male relative of the deceased monarch could have a go. I mean, it's because initially, the descendants of Genghis Khan and of the Timurids above all else didn't do that they lost Central Asia, because, there was complete mayhem, uncle against nephew, cousin against, the whole bloody lot. So you had to refine it to some extent, which even the Mughals do. I mean, from early on, it's just the sons who fight it out. So that is already a very significant evolution. Now, it may be, we can't be sure, that Shah Jahan pushing his eldest son, Dara Shukar, is also pushing towards establishing a convention of primogeniture. And the way you would do that would be to, firstly, you would try and establish it in practice, and then you would move from practice to convention and from convention to law. I mean, that's usually the way things worked in pre-modern society. He doesn't succeed because he's up against not just the ambitions of his other sons, but a relatively deeply rooted sense among the Mughal elite that this isn't legitimate, And if you went right, the other extreme of a succession system in hereditary monarchy, which is France's Salic law, initially, this is actually just a convenient ideological dressing for pushing one rather than another candidate for a vacant throne, uncle rather than daughter. But in time, it becomes rooted as a principle, not least because in the next generation, it becomes a way of keeping the English king off the French throne. So, I mean, again, it's always very, very hotly contested. It's always a dangerous issue for a monarch to touch. But it is interesting to look at those who do try and touch it, some of whom get away with it, Peter the Great, some of whom don't. It certainly takes great skill and wit, as well as great reserved power, to change the succession law. No French king could get away with that. No French king. A French king in the 18th century would even conceive of delegitimizing his eldest son and putting a younger son or the son of a second wife, let alone a legitimate son on the throne. Not a chance. Wouldn't even conceive of it, But of course, it's a very different matter when you're in the Chinese situation, where the rules are much less deeply rooted. There you do get all sorts of ins and outs about whether an empress's son has unequivocal prior rights over a concubine's son, and there isn't a clear answer to that, and it changes from dynasty to dynasty. You had a second question.
Yeah, if I may, quite quickly. So one of
come back on this one if you want.
It's really enlightening. Thank you. I actually had a question about nationalism, and it builds off of an answer to Natalie's question that I think when you talk about nationalism, it's, I think, quite correctly in the context of a multi-ethnic empire, quite a corrosive and dangerous phenomenon. But I was curious, thinking about Russia in particular, that at least often I'd thought of the Russian Российский-Русский distinction as being somewhat similar to what we have in the UK in terms of British English. But one of the things I get from this latest book actually is that how Asian cases may be even more instructive in this regard. I think you talk about India as being a potential example of this. So just, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts for those of us who, I mean, all of us are working on Russia. Should we be looking more to the Asian, the large Southeast Asian countries as parallels, thinking about how Russian nationalism is changing and may interact with the state? Or I was just curious for your thoughts, because it's was in your previous book as well, Empire. You compared British India and the Tsarist Empire, but it was something I thought would be interesting to hear.
Yeah. I got to wind my brain into gear to answer that. I mean, one immediate comment, which is partly giving me time to think more firmly, is that, you know, identities wax and wane. Just in my own life, British identity is now much weaker. In fact, I'm not sure there really is much of a British identity left as distinct from an English, Scottish, and well, of course there is a residual one, but it's a great deal weaker than it has been, I suspect, since the 18th century by now. And why is that? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. It does, to some extent, I think, have a connection to the fact that at least until the 1950s, when Britain was still conceived of as a very great world power and empire, feeling British both in spiritual and in material terms, just look at how well the Scots did out of empire, or at least some Scots, it simply resonated more. So, you know, words are like stones, you know, they're there, they don't move. But the reality is that they encapsulate a moving all the time, you know. And it's not just that an identity may be stronger or weaker. It will evolve so that some things which were very much part of its initial core become less important, whereas accretions over time, and time itself, for heaven's sake, become very, very important for it. I mean, Russia was more of a proto-nation in the 15th century than it was obviously in the 18th. And then life gets very complicated because whereas to a very significant degree, I think in the 15th and even 16th century, 16th centuries, elite and mass do to some extent share the same fundamental set of values, worldview, you name it. I mean, not by any means completely, but very obviously in a way which has many parallels later outside the First World. Russian elites become part of a fundamentally Western cultural unit, at which point, you know, it's not just that you've got the evolution of Russia from being proto-state to being multinational empire, but you've also got a deep cultural split between elite and mass, which very much complicates all sorts of ideas about identity. I mean, in one sense, seems to me, from about the 16th century, from the scientific revolution, really, and I know this is an old-fashioned view, but I think it's still mostly right, you have the increasing domination of the world by what you might describe as elites with a rational scientific worldview. And that rational scientific worldview spreads from elites in Western Europe, down then ever more deeply into the urban population of Western Europe, and then jumps to the smaller towns, the provinces, you name it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it jumps outwards beyond, you know, the core of Latin European civilization. And in one sense, you know, the gap between the still magical religious perceptions of a Castilian peasant and a member of the university-educated Spanish, you know, Madrid elite, there is a huge gap. And yet at the same time, in a sense, you know, this new scientific rational worldview does come out of an indigenous Latin European tradition. Whereas very obviously in the Russian case, and then more in many of the colonial cases, you are adopting what is somebody else's cultural tradition right back to its roots. And that, I don't think, seriously matters until the early 19th century with Romanticism and the whole sacralization, if you like, of ethno-linguistic historical identity, at which point it begins to matter a hell of a lot, you know. It's not that the resentments against foreigners didn't exist in the Russian elite in the 18th century. Of course they did, but they weren't given an ideological foundation to anything like remotely, or legitimacy to anything remotely like the same extent. I've now wandered off on a complete tangent, but it's all, I hope, somewhere relevant to the kind of things we're talking about. So who's going next?
Since Meredith already had a question opportunity to ask, maybe Suzanne?
Hello.
Hi, sure. My name is Suzanne. I'm a PhD candidate at MIT in political science. My question is sort of back on the point of one of the things that you stressed in your lecture is about how emperors, and in your book as well, how emperors are human beings and they have sort of human type impulses. And I think obviously we've talked about children in the sense of sort of this is your heir and succession and illegitimate children inheriting the throne. But my question is about sort of how having a child might impact a monarch in terms of sort of their worldview. So if there's an idea about an older man having a younger child, does it change his worldview because it creates this connection that's very personal to the younger generation? And it's a very specific version of concern about legacy or concern about somebody's purpose that sort of a regular person might have, which means more when you're in this political position.
Yeah.
I think to make it maybe a little bit more concrete, there's an argument, for example, about Vladimir Putin having sort of children more recently with the sort of illegitimate children, then sort of that changes his concern about his legacy now because he has this connection to the younger generation. If sort of you believe the sort of rumors that he has illegitimate children. But even if he doesn't, like, still question still stands.
Yeah. That's interesting and quite difficult. At one level, it comes down to something which I ask myself over and over again in the book. Look, the people the book is writing about were human beings. You and I are human beings. That links them to us. We have some of the same basic characteristics. You know, we can love, we can hate, we can envy, we can, lots of things. The fact that you and I can watch a play by Shakespeare and empathize with the emotions which are coming up tells one again that there is something, if not quite universal and unchanging, but nevertheless, something very deep and fundamental and common in terms of our understanding of human emotions, to some extent our understanding of power, all these kind of things, you know. And yet at the same time, of course, you know, if you write a book like this, if you have any kind of common sense, you know damn well that people from this very, very, very different era and culture in some ways have fundamentally different assumptions, not least about the role of the individual and the rights of the individual. Our basic conception that the individual has the right to maximize his or her identity, and that was never a pre-modern idea, and least of all in great dynasties, where the idea that you sublimated your own identity and that of your family and the family's history and the family's ambitions and grandeur was absolutely deeply rooted, and probably even more so for women than men. Again, so I mean, I'm starting out, you know, you set me all thinking, and I'm thinking in sort of vague general terms. I mean, if you were talking about a monarch and what children might matter, you would have to a great extent, I mean, A, distinguish between sons and daughters, B, distinguish between personal emotions and the basic idea of family and family in power and dynasticism, and the sense that, you know, your son is very often, to put things in contemporary jargon, the biggest pain in your arse, and at the same time part of the purpose of your existence. You know, if what you think you are, and many of these great dynastic monarchs did think that fundamentally they were part of a great dynasty which had begun almost at the beginning of history and would, you know, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons would last forever. Your son is absolutely fundamental to your whole perception of your life, your importance, your role in the universe, etc. To the extent that if you don't have a son, you almost lose much of the sense of what it's all about, what you're doing. And yet, on the other hand, your son and successor is a threat as well. He's always, to some extent, a threat. In dynasties where succession rules are not absolutely clear-cut, he's even more so. There is probably something inherent in father-daughter rather than father-son relationships, so that is also deeply cultural. I mean, my wife's Japanese. I was astonished. I brought up in a family where the father's relationship with the daughters were the closest, warmest relationships in the families. When my wife would ring up her family on the other side of the world and her father answered the phone, it simply handed over to his wife, taking it for granted that the women would want to talk to the women, but the men were not really involved. So there are deep cultural differences, of course. But there are also in Hereditary Monarchy, time and time again, the basic point that a father can afford to have warm emotional relationships with his daughters to an extent that he doesn't dare with his sons. And that is particularly the case, of course, if you're in systems where the sons fight it out for succession, because they are rivals to each other and threats to him as well. I mean, a second or third or fourth son in a European system where the succession is absolutely fixed. Look, he may have the kind of battles with his father that fathers and sons have the world over, but he isn't a threat in that kind of way. And you do find, and you can imagine, those kind of warm personal relationships. What is fascinating and rather tragic on the occasions when you can actually penetrate to some extent behind the facade and get a sense of the personality of a monarch, what it must mean for Suleiman the Magnificent actually to have a warm relationship with a younger son and know damn well that that younger son is probably going to be murdered by one of his brothers. Even if in this case the poor boy is physically, crippled in some way, whatever you call it nowadays politely, he's still going to be bumped off probably. It's very difficult for us to imagine, being the father or mother of a family where you know that it is almost inherent in the whole damn thing that some of your sons, well, all but one of your sons is going to be murdered by one of them. It's difficult to get your head around that. And of course, it's most difficult of all when you can actually see that behind the facade of the monarch, there is a human being capable of warm human relationships. In many cases, and it may sometimes be just because the sources aren't there, but it may actually, but that's the reality anyway. The monarch, the father of the dynasty, for him, his children are simply pawns in a power game. There is none of no element of the warm, personal, emotional relationship that we take for granted in close families, and that did sometimes exist in other societies, other dynasties, other periods. It's fascinating. But then again, you come back to the fact that this is biography. And it is in the nature of biography that human beings and relationships between human beings are, obviously there are patterns, there are parallels, this and that, but there is also that element of uniqueness, as we all know, if we've ever had any warm relationship with anyone. It's not quite like the warm relationship which we have with anyone else. But you asked something at the beginning, which I wanted to come back to as well, banal. And I deliberately used the word banal. Part of what I am trying to do in this book, though I don't state it quite explicitly in case I get murdered, is to remind people, of the banality also of power, the banality of power holders. Academia can be a bit too caught up in its own little debates, caught up in an obsession about being clever and obscure, and of refusing to recognize the importance of the simple and the banal and the obvious. It is actually quite important to realize that power holding is in some senses, or can often be, a very banal kind of business. It's much more fun to go off into extremely obscure understandings of ritual and this and that and everything else, and they're important. You know, the role of ritual, the role of sacredness. No dynasty lasts for very long without having some kind of sacred or sacral legitimacy. And yet at the same time, these are human beings, you know, and they have very ordinary human relationships, a bit twisted, but still fundamentally very recognizable to you and me. And I think that is an element which is worth injecting into the debate. But of course, it will mean that for some academics, particularly historians with the cultural turn, all of this does seem a little bit, you know, beneath their dignity.